Thank you again for being here, for taking some time this morning to join me. I'm feeling a little more grounded after doing a bit of breathing and landing in the space and hearing from some of you in the chat about how you're feeling. I feel more connected to the group and very excited to move through this experience with you. So I'm just making note that at this point, I can only see myself, but I can see the chat and can open that up. If anyone needs anything, has a question, type it into the chat, and then I can hop out of here and we can engage a little bit. Okay. So I'm navigating two screens, as I said, and I have them both on one mouse. So I'm feeling pretty masterful. Well, not quite. Okay, so as we settle in here, I want to start with, let's see if I can, there we go, a land acknowledgement. So in the spirit of reconciliation with this land and the diverse Indigenous people who cared for her long before me, I humbly acknowledge that I am the descendant of settlers who in many ways benefit from the devastation and harm of colonization. I am also a settler who is committed to continue learning about this land and do what I can at this point in my life to actively engage in decolonization. I am here today, living, loving, and working in Calgary, Alberta, an area called Mohkinstsis before settlers arrived. Located on the traditional lands of the Blackfoot Confederacy and the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta, consisting of Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, and the Ayaks Nakota nations, which includes Chiniki, Bearspaw, Goodstoney First Nation, and Métis Nation Region 3. I do my best to pronounce things properly, and I'm very open to feedback and support. So whether it's this portion or anything else that goes on today, that's one piece I would love from you. So this land acknowledgement and the practice of learning and engaging with truth and reconciliation is a work in progress for me, and one that I'm committed to continue doing my best to exemplify and be changed by. So what are we doing here? Welcome to my self-directed practicum project. It is a mouthful, and this will be part of the journey, is breaking down this title and potentially changing it as we go through it. So right now, well, it's already in a little bit of flux, and I'll describe that in a moment. So this is an autoethnographic journey of a trauma-informed post-colonial approach to deconstruct the colonial self from the inside out. So a bit of context and clarity. This is my first presentation. I've been working on this for 1 month. I have more questions than answers at this point. And one of the things that I realized in the first, I'd say, week of really diving into this project is that this is my life's work and not just a practicum. So part of this has been, how do I narrow the scope so that I am completing something in a 4-month practicum, while also recognizing this is much bigger and something that I'm going to continue to be working on and exploring and playing with for potentially a long time. So what we are moving through today, I am calling phase 1. So phase 1 is about setting the stage, curating a framework, a structure, something we can step into, or I can step into, that is invitational. So you are invited to step into this in a way that feels appropriate and safe for you. I also really want this to be collaborative. So I'm moving a lot slower through this process, with the intent of, I don't know what I don't know, and I don't want to rush to a finish line, because that's not the point. So as I mentioned, the title has evolved quite a bit. I started dreaming this practicum up several months ago, near the beginning of, well, once I found out about a self-directed practicum, I knew that's what I wanted to do. And I knew it had something to do with decolonization, and started as, how to decolonize oneself. And soon I realized that felt way too much like I'm centering myself in something that is not really meant to be about me. So it continued to shift and change through conversation and research until it landed here. And just this weekend, it started to shift again. I was listening to a podcast on the Internal Family Systems Talks podcast with Chris Burris. He's an internal family systems practitioner, which I'm going to talk quite a bit about throughout this presentation. And one of the things he was mentioning was the importance of not labeling any of our parts internally in a fixed or static or stagnant way, because each part is so much more than that. So for example, calling a part of ourselves a self-critic or a saboteur it's misleading and it's misunderstanding. So rather than a self-critic, it would be, a part of me that uses criticism to motivate change and cares deeply about me, and wants me to be the best version of myself, right? A much different narrative about that part than just a label of the self-critic. So that got me thinking about this part of the title, deconstructing the colonial self. I'm now in flux with that a little bit as I played with, okay, well, if I was going to use different language, different narrative about this, perhaps it would be, rather than the colonial self, it would be a part that has inherited perpetrator or colonial energy to manage shame and fear from the legacy of what happened in order to adapt and survive, and to protect the deep pain of separation from the higher self. Also a mouthful. So potentially what this might shift into is an autoethnographic journey of a trauma-informed post-colonial approach to deconstruct colonial consciousness. So a little bit of a different flavor there. And I'm throughout this presentation, I'm going to shift the language of the title slightly. And this is another piece that I would invite you to feel into. What lands best for you, or any insights you have around this title. So that brings me to next slide. So understanding white supremacy culture has been a big part of my project, and looking into the white supremacy culture website has taken up a lot of my time so far. It's a beautiful website, and this quote is touching into a piece of what I am exploring here. So it's, I would say, at least from my perspective, it's more obvious that white supremacy targets and violates BIPOC people and communities with the intent to destroy them directly. The flip side to it is also that white supremacy targets and violates white people with a persistent invitation to collude that will inevitably destroy their humanity. It is making us all sick, and it's impacting and affecting us in different ways. So why I wanted to mention this is because part of this project is centering myself. Yet I also needed to be very mindful that I can't just make this about me. I can't center myself all the time. So I'm thinking of it as a pulse. And this quote was really helpful from Lama Rod Owen's book, The New Saints. He says, "There is no collective liberation without individual liberation. Understanding freedom for oneself makes it possible to understand and engage in liberatory work for the collective." So while I'm on this path to decenter white supremacy culture and colonial influences in my psyche, I'm hoping that I can be a better support for others to help them liberate themselves as well. So what to expect today? I am going to briefly dive into some positionality statements about myself, obviously, I want you to know who I am, and that'll be sprinkled throughout this presentation. I also want to be really clear on not only where my research questions are at this point, but also what kind of feedback and support could be helpful if that's something that you would like to engage with me in. I also want to give a little bit of context into how I got here above and beyond the positionality statement. There were some key experiences and learnings that I see as the foundation that set me up for this project, and I'd like to share that. I'll then get into more of the definitions and the context of this mouthful of a title, so we can see how it weaves together. And at least from my perspective at this point, all of the words in the title are necessary. But I'm very aware of the fishbowl effect, and I'm constantly asking myself, what am I not seeing? Because I'm in the middle of the fishbowl. So I'm very much in the fishbowl of this project right now, and any outside perspective is very helpful. And I'll finish with some goals and direction. So talking a little bit about what do I see as phase 2 and maybe a phase 3 as this project continues to unfold. All right, so welcome to me. I ended up putting these pictures into a bit of a spiral. I wanted them to tell a story of who I am, where I've been, and how I got to where I am today. So, you know, broadly speaking, initially, I am a white, able-bodied, 37-year-old, neurodivergent, cisgender female. I am a 4th-generation Canadian, and much of my heritage is English and Irish. I am also in a heterosexual relationship of 17 years with my partner, Andrew, and I'm in my first year of my clinical Master of Social Work program at the U of C. So starting up in the left-hand corner, this is the first half of my family, at least. 3 more children were born after me, but this is the older 4, as we call ourselves. So I have Mormon pioneers on both sides of my family, and I was raised as the middle child of 7 kids in a very devout Mormon family. From an early age, I had various mental health afflictions and behavioral addictions that steadily increased in intensity and danger, and all of which I have come to realize were complex and intensified due to my neurodivergent makeup, which I'm still unpacking and trying to discern, which I'll get into a little bit later. I recall a lot of my younger years were spent with thoughts like, when I get X, then I'll be happy. It was always this future oriented, like there's always a reason why I'm miserable or lonely or sad. It was always something outside of me in the future. I just need to get that. And one after another, I kept achieving due to my part of my, I'd say OCD complex is I can be very focused, very dedicated when I put my mind to something. And one of those big goals was I wanted to be a professional basketball player. So that third picture in the left is me in my grade 12 year after winning some pretty big awards, and I've got a full ride scholarship to play basketball at San Diego State. And that really was I would say the beginning of the end in many ways, because I was on this beautiful campus in San Diego and was more miserable than I'd ever been. And it was very scary. I was not, a lot of my afflictions had intensified in many different ways. So I was not taking care of myself, and I was harming myself in a lot of ways. So I ended up coming back to Canada and continued playing basketball for a couple years, but was really unwell. So it got to a point where I realized I'm not going to last much longer. I need to figure this out. So I stopped playing basketball and I focused on school and art. I was taking a lot of philosophy classes at the U of A at the time, and finally graduated. And soon after that, my dad had left the church the Mormon church when I was 16, and I didn't realize how indoctrinated I had been. And in my early 20s, I had an existential crisis when it kind of felt like the last bit of belief, a belief in life after death, belief in heaven, was no longer, like, it just left my body, and I was suddenly surrounded by fear of death, fear of life, and I was inconsolable. I remember how much I was shaking for a long time, but it was a breakdown that turned into a breakthrough. I was able to start to rebuild, who I want to be, and I continued researching, learning, trying to figure out how the brain and body works. It was very top down at that point in my life, of just what habits do I need to develop? What do I need to know about what makes somebody healthy, and just repeat it until it becomes my new normal. So I wrote a book about my experience overcoming my mental health struggles in my early 30s. And from there, stepped fully into facilitating, teaching yoga, taking countless yoga, meditation, movement trainings. This led me towards finding breath work, finding somatics, finding therapeutic psychedelics, and got to the point where I felt like, okay, now I understand what bottom up is. I came back into relationship with my body. I found internal family systems, which has been life-changing for me, to be able to find a sense of spirituality, an essence of who I am, and to be able to reparent parts of myself that had been exiled or in deep struggle for a long time. So I've reconnected with good friends. I feel like my relationship to movement, to food, to family, there's a lot of repairing happening still, and will be as part of phase 2. Some bigger things that I need to dive into. But that's a little bit about me. Okay. Research questions. So one of the obvious ones is, well, what does a trauma-informed post-colonial approach to deconstruct colonial consciousness mean? Why is it valuable? And what does it look like? As well as, what are the effective ways to educate, get a buy-in, and experientially produce shared vulnerability? What must we understand about white supremacy culture to do this work of deconstructing colonialism from the inside out effectively? A big piece with that one is just how I've recognized that deconstruction and decolonization, while really important pursuits, also produce a lot of confusion of not really knowing how. I had a lot of work on, let's do it, it's important, but the how to I've found to be confusing. And that's been a big piece of this project, is whatever I'm doing, I want it to be a how to, not just an experience or research. It's, what does it look like? How do we do it? What's the framework? So how to frame this in a way that is gentle, inclusive, and invitational towards our protective parts, or in other words, how to make this work safe enough so that potentially other white-bodied folks are able to step into it as well. And this last one I actually just added in recently, as I've become more aware. I'm really curious in my own process is how I can start to discern between what are essential qualities of my neurodivergence and what are cultural or legacy burdens that I've inherited, or trauma or protective parts in my system. So that's one for me to unpack during phase 2 as well. All right, so feedback and support that could be helpful. So keeping this pretty simple as we're going through this. If you have any resources or connections with folks doing similar work, or that you just think would be an interesting conversation, I'd love for you to make note of that. And if you're able to connect with me after, it would be so appreciated, as well as your preliminary impressions, your feelings, even your moments of discomfort, and if and when those discomforts were soothed. I've found this process to be fascinating so far in one-on-one or small group discussions about this project. Specifically that at certain points, especially the beginning, there can be some reactions to what I'm saying. And so far, as the conversation continues, those discomforts are soothed as more context and understanding and relatability is created. But I'm really fascinated with those points. Those are the points where I want to be even more mindful of my language, to make sure that I'm slowing down. And again, it comes back to that inclusive, invitational language that I want to have this whole project supported by. And then more broadly, just what curiosities this left you with. Moving forward now into how I got here. So there are 4 specific pieces that I'm going to speak to add a bit more context around this project before I dive into the title. So the first one is internal family systems. So internal family systems was developed by family systems psychologist, Dr. Richard Schwartz, in the early 1980s. And it was in response to hearing his clients often refer to parts of themselves in complex relationships that mirrored external family dynamics. So this model is guided by tenets that lead to a harmonious, inclusive, and collaborative internal system versus unifying into a single hegemonic self. So this quote from Richard Schwartz is, "It is becoming increasingly clear that the idea of the mind as unitary is a relatively recent invention of civilized society. Indigenous cultures throughout the world were familiar and comfortable not only with a spirit world, but also with an inner realm inhabited by many different voices and characters. It may be that the idea of the normal mind as multiple is less a radical departure from established knowledge than it is returning to an age-old wisdom from which established knowledge radically departed." So the assumption in this model is that all parts have a good intention, an intention of protecting us from internal and external harm, and they need to be met with love and a critical mass of safety so there can be an update and a release. It also teaches about a higher self, and this higher self emerges when our parts relax, and this essence is akin to our spirit, the internal manifestation of source or God or love, Buddha nature, the all, or the wise, unconditionally loving internal parent, in which all parts can lean in for a secure attachment. So this is a pathway back to who we were before the wounding of separation and chronic disconnection. Now, a quote that really helps exemplify this for me is from Maya Angelou, when she says, "There's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you." So I like to think about every part inside as having its own story, a story of how it got its job, what it's trying to protect, what it fears would happen if it stopped doing this job. And as we lean in with love to listen, we hear this history, the good intentions, the desire to protect in the only way they know how currently. Our sense of empathy and compassion increases, and this supports elevating the critical mass of safety in which massive change is possible. And as Brene Brown says, people are hard to hate close up, so move in. Now, an important piece here is that while connection is important, leaning in is important, it's not enough. We also must unburden the exiles, the deep pain, the deep wounds from trauma of disconnection that are being protected. And how we do that sounds simple. Of course, it's more complex, but we witness, we feel, we show up with compassion, with curiosity, with creativity and vulnerability. So the next piece here is this wonderful book by Resmaa Menakem called My Grandmother's Hands. I read this before I even applied to get into the MSW program. And it was the first book that I had read that connected internalized trauma with colonial history of harm in various ways. So Menachem focuses on compassionate education to understand the virus of white body supremacy inflicting us all in different ways. The need for change on the inside and outside of dominant power structures, and the importance of communal experiences to release stored trauma and come back into healthy relationship with each other. So he teaches that abolishing institutions or systems is not enough. We must abolish racism and trauma in our bodies. Specifically for white-bodied people, this includes recognizing a core intergenerational trauma wound of separation from self and culture as colonization happened to our ancestors before they became the colonizers, and from brutalizing each other before there was racial violence. So as a white-bodied social worker, I can take the suggestion of Resmaa Menachem and create space for white-bodied people to come together to build culture around reckoning with generations of trauma and systemic and internalized racism, as well as building capacity and anti-fragility around racialized topics of conversation. And using somatics, Menachem educates and guides participants to recognize generations of trauma that resides in different colored bodies, and the necessity to come back home to our bodies, as we cannot, so we can stop brutalizing each other as protection from what's going on internally. So the next piece is my entry into the master's program at the University of Calgary. So why this is important is right from day one, I've been steeping in the arena of social work's colonial history and how it has and is transforming with anti-oppressive frameworks. This has been life-changing already to be in this program. And I found myself quite caught off guard in a few conversations outside of the MSW environment when I would speak about what I was learning about white privilege and colonization, and would be met with defense or denial or aversion. And I knew I needed to remain curious and understanding in those conversations. And so one of my research papers that will definitely influence this project was one that I titled White Privilege: From Contentious Conversations to Compassionate Collaboration. So this started really looking into what's happening in our psyche. What are the protective mechanisms that are coming up in these conversations, and why? With more understanding, we're able to slow down and meet people where they're at and stay in a conversation that otherwise could have just turned into defensiveness. So at the same time, in another one of my classes, I had the opportunity to learn and research about practice models and frameworks, and we were given the opportunity to create our own if we would like. So I began to experiment with what would it look like to create a framework that is focused on decolonization, and developed what I called an eclectic relationality for transformative social work. The basic premise of this was the understanding that we need to focus on the micro, but also the meso and the macro. And there needs to be a pulse of moving in and moving out so that we're continuing to grow and support each other, yet recognizing we need to do the work on ourselves and in community so that we can change what's happening in our society. So one piece I want to pause on before I move to the next is that what I found to be particularly nourishing during this period of time were the words of bell hooks, who so wisely encourages that dismantling needs to be done with love at the foundation, both in action that dismantles dichotomies woven within the colonial culture of domination, and as an anchor to hold on to, as dismantling will temporarily cause a loss of what is currently the ground our systems rely upon. So this is something I'm going to keep coming back to, is that as we decenter something, we need to recenter something else. And that concept of love, of compassion, is when I feel like I've lost the ground, I just come back to love. And I invite you to do the same thing. So last piece here is the self-directed practicum. So once I realized I had the opportunity to engage in this type of practicum, I knew it was exactly what I needed to really dive into this burgeoning awareness. I wanted to explore, I wanted to create. So some words that I found really helpful at the beginning of this is from the book Research is Ceremony. Sean Wilson says that our research serves the purpose of building a closer relationship with the idea or topic of our research. I also found Dr. Seema Barmania, who shares, in the words of one of her mentors, the research does not change anything. It's the research that changes you. In the book, Body-Mind Psychotherapy, the Hakomi Method, Ron Kurtz starts by quoting Moshe Feldenkrais. And he said he was so fond of telling us, Moshe Feldenkrais is a somatic practitioner. And he would say, you can't do what you want till you know what you're doing. Kurtz goes on to say that when you know how you are organizing your experience, you become free to organize it in new ways. When you change not just what you experience, but how you experience, you have transcended. You have become a different self. You have transcended the habits and beliefs you were stuck in and controlled by. You now have options. You do things and feel things in new ways. You have changed at the level of character. Your personal paradigm has shifted. So with that, I am committed to no longer blindly collude with white supremacy culture. And that requires that I see it, that I see myself, that I observe it in my actions, my thoughts, my belief structures. And as my awareness of this infliction in my psyche grows, I can then deconstruct it. I can change how I respond to it, and I can replace it in my system with something else. Through this repetitive commitment, I can create change from the inside out. And now we'll move into the title of my project. So I want to begin with this image of, I can't remember how to pronounce it, a boros, the snake eating its own tail. I didn't know what it was called. I just kept seeing this image in my mind when I would picture this project, feel into the multi-layers of it, try to describe it to people. I would often start with like, picture a snake eating its tail. And then I would start talking about the project. So the wisdom of the circle has been arising for me more and more. And the symbol of a snake eating its tail has been a common visual as well. To me, it encapsulates the layers, the multidimensional aspects of our shadow self, resonance and frequency acting like a magnet and a mirror, the protective impulse to point my finger outwards and comfortably settle in victim consciousness, and the necessity to keep turning my finger back in towards myself to get to know the hurt that is being protected. So this journey is a death and rebirth. It has the potential for a lot of confusion, and the autoethnography is both process and product. So why I chose an autoethnographic framework was a few reasons. So one is that it utilizes an invitational approach through storytelling and vulnerability, both of which are powerful ways of sharing and learning, as well as being strongly aligned with Indigenous ways of knowing. As the renowned Audre Lorde so aptly depicted in a speech in 1984, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. In order for me to engage in deconstruction of colonialism from the inside out, I am resolutely aware that the tools I use and the mindset in my approach need constant reflection and consideration. As Ellis in 2009 describes, the relationality and reflective nature of autoethnography is a method that resists colonialist research tactics that are authoritative and extractive. So this aspect of the method is imperative, as I am aware of the possibility of blindly using colonialist methods while attempting to engage in decolonizing work. So the more vulnerable I can be throughout this process, the more likely it is I will notice when my tools being employed come from white supremacy culture, or someone else will be able to offer me that feedback. From Tima Oken on the white supremacy culture website, she says, "We are strongest when we are allowed to be vulnerable with ourselves and each other. White supremacy culture does not allow for vulnerability, and that is a tragedy for us all." So to summarize what an autoethnography looks like, Paulos in 2021 came up with 6 points. So I'll read them briefly. An autoethnography is a qualitative research method that uses a researcher's personal experience to describe and critique cultural beliefs, practices, and experiences, acknowledges and values a researcher's relationships with others, uses deep and careful self-reflection, typically referred to as reflexivity, to name and interrogate the intersections between self and society, the particular and the general, the personal and the political. Shows people in the process of figuring out what to do, how to live, and the meaning of their struggles. Balances intellectual and methodological rigor, emotion, and creativity, and strives for social justice to make life better. Trauma-informed. So including a trauma-informed approach in this work, to me, is also foundational. It emphasizes the need for us to retain a general understanding at all times that we all have experienced various forms of trauma throughout our lives, and we all use various protective mechanisms when those traumas and harms are touched in various ways. So when an internal unprocessed trauma is touched, we tend to be overwhelmed with big feelings that leave us feeling vulnerable and in need of loving support and care. When we are unclear on how to offer that to ourselves, or when we're in the presence of another who is unclear and unequipped to be with these big feelings, we learn to shove these feelings back down and intensify the impulse to protect these feelings from coming up and out again. And this all happens in a microsecond beneath conscious awareness. So Linklater makes the important note that trauma as a term originates from the Western world, and for many implies a pathology that the individual is responsible for. She also asserts that to understand trauma, we must include the broader systemic force caused by the state's abuse of power. So for Linklater, more accurately and holistically speaking, trauma refers to a person's reaction or response to an injury, and expands to include O'Neill's definition or work, who writes, "In traumatic situations, all those integrated components of the embodied response, arousal, attention, perception, and emotion, tend to persist in an altered and exaggerated state long after the specific danger is over." So similarly expressed, Dr. Gabor Mate, who says, "Trauma is not the event that happened, it is the impact of that event, which is the disconnection from ourselves. This accumulated stress is archived in the body and remains there as a constant undertone, communicating the wounds of, as Stephen Porges says, chronic disruption of connectedness." Okay, so to be trauma-informed is not only to understand that this is a natural process of protection, it's also impetus to learn skills of engaging, teaching, and holding space for ourselves and others so that big feelings can be met with love and guided to be processed and released. This requires that we are mindful of the language we use when engaging in sensitive subjects, as well as developing deep patience and curiosity so that when others' protective mechanisms are deployed, we can see them for what they are and stay in loving connection as a way to increase safety signals and invite them back into conversation. So something I've been saying about this project is that I can collaboratively build this house for you to experience along with me, and I can open the door and I can give you a guided tour, but only you can choose to step in. Postcolonial approach. So postcolonialism assumes that what was created in colonial times, like art, literature, foundational practices, beliefs, and systems of society, when created from the perspective of those benefiting and potentially blind to coloniality, is inherently racialized and continues to directly feed into the colonial narrative. So as a theoretical procedure, it is employed to interpret, read, and critique the cultural practices of colonialism and how the optic of race enables the colonial powers to represent, reflect, refract, and make visible Native cultures in inferior ways. So when I consider my project, postcolonialism informs me regarding the ways to approach deconstruction. So when the postcolonial lens is directed inwards, I am guided to be intently curious to deconstruct my implicit biases that represent the other in inferior ways. As I explore my internal relationality, I am curious to notice power dynamics that include a sense of wanting power over as potential parts that have taken on the energy of the colonizer. I also need to shine a compassionate light on how my system took on beliefs that perpetuate colonialism. I will do this by exploring the historical context of my ancestry. This includes relooking and rethinking about my history with colonization so that I am including the voice and the perspective of the other while understanding my identity. I also must continually engage in new dialogues with others and ensure I am not perpetuating a universal or essentialist claim that highlights the voices and perspectives of Eurocentrism or individualism without the inclusion of the other. So, deconstruction of colonial consciousness from the inside out. It is first important for me to acknowledge that there are conflicting arguments in this field that express criticism towards the relationship between post-colonialism and deconstruction as being ineffective. Drischel in 2013 explores this dynamic and exemplifies that while deconstruction is especially well suited for understanding and dismantling colonialism, it also has a tendency to trigger fear and reactivity within the post-colonial field. And as we have already noted, a problem arises when our good intentions are clouded by a reactive internal system. When we are led by fear, by protection, we revert back to habitual ways of doing things, which often includes furthering the colonial agenda. So referring to the work of Michael Nass, Drischel denotes that deconstruction is always referring to the self or autos. And as such, he goes on to say, deconstruction cannot but rekindle latent memories of a prior traumatized state, a colonial shattering of identity, or a wound inscribed at the heart of an identity no longer coinciding with itself, the recurrence of which is being anxiously defended against. In other words, my suspicion is that what post-colonialism's conflicted relationship with deconstruction is about, at heart, is its own unresolved trauma and lingering vulnerability, a vulnerability that rather than being radically accepted, is being defended against at all costs. So this offers me two important reminders. First, one of the constellation of parts I am curious to get to know inside of me potentially has had an experience of a colonial shattering of identity or a wound inscribed at the heart of an identity no longer coinciding with itself and the reactive defenses that protect it. Second, this also reminds me of how easy it is to slip back into old ways of doing things, and even an agenda to deconstruct colonialism from the inside out, if being approached with fear or an activated nervous system that has been triggered into a defensive state, can be furthering the colonial agenda. Having two screens clearly distracts me a little bit. I should have moved through these earlier, but that's okay. Okay, we're coming to the end here. I know we only have a few minutes left, so just very briefly, I've kind of talked about this already a little bit, but from what I've shared, this is informing what I will be looking for in my internal system, knowing that this is a work in progress. And part of potentially phase 2 will be another presentation where I share a map of my system from what I have discovered. And potentially that map will also include a bit of a how-to framework that I can share in facilitations or content online for others who want to explore this type of internal work. So in brief, what I'm looking for, seeking a relationship with, are parts that fear connection or have intense reactions in moments of disconnection, parts with intense shame, like a belief that I am bad, the black hole tangled with shame, fear, loneliness, and grief, parts that carry isms, othering, or power over, parts that operate with beliefs or perspectives that align with white supremacy culture. So what does that look like? At this point for phase 2, as I do the work, I'm well versed and love the support with internal family systems, breath work, and craniosacral. So I will be receiving support, body work, and facilitation with these modalities, as well as being very open to other modalities if anyone has any recommendations. I would love to experience a sweat lodge if that can happen organically and authentically. Continuing with a lot of self-reflection and writing. I've been doing a blog series on my website for each week. So there's 4 posts so far, and I'll continue to track my progress over the next several weeks. I intend to attend a recovery group. The peace with my lineage. So spending some time coming back into relationship with members of my family that I feel some disconnection around. And doing the research, doing the work to really understand my lineage and my colonial history. So I come back to finish where I began. This reminder that when you know how you are organizing your experience, you become free to organize it in new ways. When you change not just what you experience, but how you experience, you have transcended. You have become a different self. You have transcended the habits and beliefs you were stuck in and controlled by. You now have options. You do things and feel things in new ways. You have changed at the level of character. Your personal paradigm has shifted. So thank you. Let's take a couple slow, mindful breaths as we finish our time together. I've got my list of references here. If anyone has something they'd like to follow up on, I can send you the resource. So thank you for joining me. I hope this has been illuminating and interesting at the very least. And if you have time to stay and chat, I would love that. So I know we've got 2 minutes until 11, and I'm going to keep recording this part's just for me. Thank you. I see some things popping in the chat, which I also realize now I was not monitoring during that presentation. Too many things happening at once. I get overstimulated very easily. But thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Keep popping in the chat. That's wonderful. If you want to speak out loud,